Thanks a lot for stopping by. I really appreciate you taking the time. Glad to have this man back. It's Dan Brouillette. He's the former United States Secretary of Energy. Dan, how are you? Good to talk to you, man.
I'm doing great, Joe. How you doing?
I'm living the dream. Hopefully the new year is good for you. I wanted to get into some of the stuff that we see Biden doing, as he's, no pun intended, doing some scorched earth on the way out. When it comes to energy, the guy's trying to tie the hands of energy producers, trying to tie the hands of energy independence in this country, where we used to be a net energy exporter. I want to go back a few years, though, and he claims that he is now allowed for more production of oil and natural gas in this country because of his way of doing things than Trump did. Now, the net amount that we're getting out might be more, but is that in spite of him or because of him?
Yeah, that's a good choice of words, Joe. It's not because he allowed it to happen. It happened in spite of him. This is an incredible industry, very innovative. They developed the technologies that we all now take for granted, things like hydraulic fracturing. They've become more and more efficient throughout the history of the United States, and certainly over the last few years. And it's because innovation that they've been able to raise the levels of production here in the United States and frankly other parts of the world as well. But here's the important point, Joe, and you know this because of your background and because of you and I have had this conversation over the years. In economics, when you create scarcity, prices generally go up, right?
Yeah.
If demand stays the same and you create scarcity, prices go up. And what we've seen over the last few years is that while production of oil and gas in the United States has in fact gone up, we've set records in the last 2 or 3 years, consumers are not really seeing the benefit of that increased supply in the marketplace because this administration has decided to make that production more expensive.
Yes.
And that's what we're seeing with environmental regulation, with legal challenges, with permitting delays. All of those things have raised the cost of production here in the United States, and consumers are not seeing the benefit of that increased production.
It's Dan Brouillette. Go follow him, Dan_Brouillette over on X, former energy secretary. So when Biden says we're producing more, when his administration says we're producing more, the regulations and the regulatory climate has made it so much more expensive that we aren't seeing the benefit at the pump. But I have to imagine, Dan, that the animosity from central government for fossil fuels has to be adding to the fact that the prices aren't going to come down because those companies fear for their very existence, don't they?
Well, they do, and that's the risk that's the risk premium you also see in this market. For decades, the United States has been the best place in the world to do business. That's what business will tell you. Anywhere in the world, they want to come here to do business because we have things like certainty of law, you have certainty of contract certainty.
Right.
When you sign your name to a document, you can rely upon it. It's going to be there. But what's happened, with the environmental push here in America, with some of the actions of this administration, we've created a higher risk profile for doing business here in the United States. Is a permit a permit? We saw that happen in Texas just recently with an LNG producer, where the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission actually issued a permit. That company went to market, raised capital on the basis of being granted that permit, and then we saw legal challenges to that permit, and it was rescinded. It was vacated in the eyes of the law. So that you ask yourself a basic question: when can you rely on these things? When is a permit actually a permit? It's that type of risk profile that some of these environmental policies, some of the actions of this administration have caused to raise these actions have caused the price of energy production here in the United States to go up.
It is Dan Brouillette, former United States Energy Secretary. As we watch the Keystone XL pipeline ceased and stopped, I'm not sure I understand how he's able to do that. So the former president and you were very involved in saying yes to Canada, friendly crude coming from Canada down to the Gulf Coast in Houston, going to refine it down there. We had a great setup, just had to get it there. Now, we know that we were getting it there through the railways, which benefits some big donors for the left. That's not lost on me. But stopping the Keystone XL pipeline, once President Trump said it was going to happen, how is that able to happen? 11,000 people lost their jobs immediately. We stopped doing the pipeline. Canada now has to say, well, who do I sell it to? China? You and I have talked about China wanting that oil. How does that even happen? Once it's done, it's almost like with the border wall as well. It was done, the contractors were paid, the materials were there, and then they just didn't do anything. How is that allowed? Is there, as you said, in this country, a contract is supposed to mean something? A grant of a lease is supposed to mean something. Can he just stop it because he's the king?
Well, we have to separate it to some degree, Joe, from the legal process, if you will. So a contract is a contract. You have your day in court. You can argue whatever you'd like to argue.
Yeah.
In certain cases, the president has authority, but through executive order, to do something or to not do something, or to ban something or to unban something, as President-elect Trump says now.
Yeah.
That is the case in certain cases. Other times, it's just a signal that's being sent to the marketplace. Look, you can proceed if you'd like to, but I'm going to make your life miserable. I'm going to make your life miserable. We're going to sue you at every corner. We're going to stop you through regulatory action to the extent we can. And companies just make the decision on their own. Look, this is too much. This is a step too far. We're not going to pursue the project. We saw that with pipelines in the Mid-Atlantic region on the eastern coast of the United States, where literally it took an act of Congress to allow a pipeline to be built to deliver natural gas to certain states in the east. We saw another pipeline where the arguments went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the companies decided at the end of that process, even though they won the Supreme Court decision, not to build the pipeline.
Wow.
Because at that point, the economics of the project simply just didn't work for them. So, the government has a very strong hand in some of these matters. And sometimes it's a very direct hand, as I said earlier, through an executive order to do something or not do something. Sometimes it's simply the threat that I will harm you that will cause companies to look the other way.
It's interesting knowing your former position, but do you think there should be a Department of Energy? I mean, each state should be able to handle it on their own, and I don't see anything about energy in the Constitution. Should there be a DOE?
Should there be a DOE? Look, I think the mission of the department is important. It's important to remember what the Department of Energy is and what it's not. It is not a regulatory body like the EPA, or in certain instances.
But they've
like
made
the
it that,
Department
haven't
of
they?
Interior. Well, I'm sorry?
They've made it that, haven't they?
They've needed it.
No, not needed. I don't think you heard me. They made it a regulatory organization when it shouldn't
be.
It
that. I'm sorry.
Isn't that what Biden has done?
Yeah, to a certain. I mean, they have certain powers that you could argue they shouldn't have. Things like the ability to grant an authorization to export liquefied natural gas, for instance. I mean, we can have a robust conversation about whether or not the Department of Energy should be doing that in the first instance. Yeah. As President Trump told me, he said, when is it not in the public interest to create jobs? When is it not in the public interest to sell our products to the world? And he's absolutely correct. And the Department of Energy, in certain instances, has suggested that it might not be in the public interest to export liquefied natural gas around the world.
In what way?
Whatever reason.
There's no reason. Well, Dan, you and I talked about it. President Trump sat down with the EU and said, if you want me to protect you from Russia, stop buying their LNG. Buy it from me. They said, okay, you're right. We have to buy it from you. But now, from what I understand, there aren't enough terminals, and they're not sending the LNG that was contracted to send. I mean, how is that game a winner for America?
It is not a winner, and that's why this pause or this ban or whatever you'd like to call it was simply outrageous. And the Department of Energy really had no business in doing this. It didn't make any political sense. It didn't make any economic sense. And it didn't even make environmental sense, which is the argument that they tried to use. Natural gas is a clean fuel. In many cases, it is displacing, things like, frankly, dung in places like India.
Wow.
or wood, heavy hydrocarbons. So, I mean, we're taking in, positive environmental steps by making U.S. natural gas available around the world. Their arguments just didn't have any credence and credibility whatsoever.
Dan Brouillette, former United States Secretary of Energy. Follow him, Dan_Brouillette. Brouillette. Dan, I've said this right for all these years. Brouillette. Go follow him over on X. It's Brouillette is his name. It's a great French name. So, Dan, as we watch this, and Biden now, again, doing all he can to screw up the incoming administration, says he's putting a moratorium, complete ban on any outer continental shelf drilling. I think you and I talked about this. If we don't drill off the southern east coast, then China will, along with Cuba, and go and get all the resources that God meant for us. So what is this all about? And again, Biden comes in, canceled Keystone XL. He changes the rules on everything. Yet for some reason on the way out, he can somehow tie the hands of Trump when it comes to the outer continental shelf, or not?
Yeah, well, I think people want to make the case that he can tie the hands because they hope that this ban stays in effect and it becomes, quote, permanent. I doubt that that's going to happen. They're relying on some circuit court judge who was, made some decision a couple of years ago during Mr. Trump's first term. I don't think that decision is going to stand. It will be appealed. It'll go to the Supreme Court. And there are other simple things that Congress can do to allow this ban to be lifted very quickly. But it's important to understand exactly what President Biden just did. I mean, the amount of land, the area that we're talking about is larger than Texas and Alaska combined.
Oh, wow.
Larger than those two states combined. That's an awful lot of resources that he is taking off of the map, if you will. And as we just said earlier, Joe, I mean, look, this is basic economics. If you create scarcity, prices go up. And I think that's the intent of this administration, is to ensure that energy prices stay high so that they can, drive the consumer into areas that they like, be it wind or solar or other types of energy production. That's really what their goal is here. There's no other rationale for doing something like this.
It is Dan Brouillette. We always appreciate the time and the access to the knowledge. What do you make of these of the $7 billion or $9 billion spent to build a few charging stations for electric vehicles? I mean, that blows my mind. And when the transportation secretary was asked about it, Pete Buttigieg, he said, "Hey, these things take time." I mean, Dan, what are we looking at? Billions and billions of dollars to build charging stations, and we got like a few.
It just demonstrates the inefficiency of government. It's outrageous that they would use taxpayer money in this way. There are so many private companies out there. To the extent there is consumer demand for EVs, or to the extent that there's consumer demand for additional charging stations, there's always somebody out there who's going to seize the moment, look at that as an opportunity, and put private capital to work to build out those types of facilities. The fact that there isn't enough demand for that type of activity should tell the government something. The fact that they just wasted $7 billion of taxpayer money on this, you can't describe it as anything other than outrageous.
Well, I mean, you said something that's very important, and the Trump administration did this a lot, not only with you, but also with Ben Carson as the HUD secretary, using private money in conjunction with government ability to build, these I don't think they were called enterprise zone, but he had some sort of zones, these economic zones into lower income areas that were building housing and so on. But the people in the community were on the hook because they were financing it. Same thing with electric vehicles and these charging stations. Why would we ever want the government to be in charge of that when you know that the government is the least efficient body in this entire country? Incentivize those who have the money to invest in them, because it's better for the future, or it offers an opportunity for people who want to drive electric vehicles. I'm not one of them, by the way, but why would you ever allow government just to take tax money and say, we'll do it? We see how efficient or non-efficient it is every single time.
No, you shouldn't. You shouldn't do it, and that's where this Biden administration has gotten so far off course. That's why, Joe, when we talk about things like tax credits, if you think about what a tax credit is, it allows you to minimize your tax bill due to the government. Well, why would you have a tax bill due in the first place?
Right.
It's probably because you have income. And if you think about tax credits as a philosophical matter, what you want to do is incentivize private industries to invest capital, to more importantly make money, so that they would have a credit to apply to that income, so that they can reduce their tax burden. That's how you attract capital to these projects. And that's what I think as a country, we ought to think about that in terms of what it is we want. I think for nuclear power, for instance, it might make some sense to create the right tax credits to attract that private capital to these important energy sources. What you never want, at least in my personal view, is for the government to have a blank check to spend your money on things that they don't fully understand.
Well, they do that right now, and they do it very, very well, which is very bad for us. It's Dan Brouillette, former United States Secretary of Energy. Dan, I asked somebody this the other day, and they kind of scoffed at it. I wonder if you'll scoff at it as well. Can we or can we not become energy independent? What I mean is, our oil doesn't go in the world market. We keep it for ourselves. We use the gasoline that we produce, the oil that we produce, and so on. And then we actually put some of ours in the world market and let us reap the benefit from it. Why are we somehow still reliant on OPEC and Venezuela and all these bad guys when we seem to have enough resources ourselves?
Not only can we did. In 2019, we became a net energy exporter under President Trump. So we were, in fact, energy dependent. We can do that. The question is, whether or not we want to restructure our infrastructure here in the United States. There are certain refineries, for instance, that rely upon heavy crude from Canada, from Mexico in certain instances, and yes, from the Middle East, because that's what they refine. And, we produce a sweet crude, a light crude here in the United States. So there's a big difference. My point in that is that there's a big difference between being dependent and relying upon those oil sources to come in from Canada and choosing to trade with other countries.
All right, so we take our sweet crude to those who can refine it. We get their heavy crude so we can refine it. So that makes common sense. And maybe economically we can have a budget surplus or an import surplus or an export surplus, whatever it is, and we can reap the benefit. For some reason, this administration has seemed to want us to go broke, and energy is a big reason why they're doing it. In your heart of hearts, do you know why they want us to go broke? Is it about an economic reset so that they have all the control? What is this?
It's hard to know what the motives are, Joe, to be honest. But at least with regard to energy, you can see at least some of the motive, and that is to drive consumers to certain products that they think are more important for the environment. Or, candidly, with all due respect, they have friends who raise money for them, and that's the industry that they do. I mean, if you're a wind producer or solar producer, right, or you create EVs or whatever, there's all sort of motivations that policymakers or politicians use for these for the policies that they promote. But the bottom line is that we have to let the markets decide, and we need to forget about buzzwords like energy transition.
Yeah, what is that?
The world's always been in transition. We've transitioned from using wood to using coal, from using coal to using natural gas, from natural gas to nuclear power. It's always been in a state of transition. The transition that has never occurred is a transition away from one fuel source to another. We still use whale oil in this world. And we're going to continue to add energy because populations grow, economies grow, and there's just never going to be an instance where we move away from one source of energy, which is what some in this administration and perhaps in certain non-governmental organizations, environmental groups, and whatnot would have us think that we can do.
It's Dan Brouillette. Go follow him, Dan_Brouillette over on X. Appreciate the time and the access. Last question, Dan. When President Trump takes over noon on January 20th, what's the first thing he should do? What's the first thing he should sign as far as energy, oil, and so on that first day?
Lift the LNG ban, allow the markets to be created, allow production here in the United States to continue to flourish as it did under his first term.
Dan Brouillette, always appreciate the time and the access. It was short notice today, and I'm glad you jumped on. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joe. Great to be with you.
All right, brother. Happy New Year. We're back after this on the Joe Pag Show. Stay right here.